What's up guys, Maxim here, back again with another Academy FM video, and this tutorial is going to be the following video talking about mixing and mastering, but in regards to compression and how that is used differently in both of these processes. So when we're mixing, we're really focusing on getting a sound out of our compressors. We're most of the time going to be using them to control a certain sound to help it sit in the mix a bit better, or to say, especially if we're using a vintage emulation, we're going to be really trying to drive that compressor to get a sound out of it. And that, compared to the mastering approach to using compressors, is very, very different in the sense that in mastering we're trying to, yes, get a subtle characteristic out of maybe a compressor that we're using, but it more so acts as a glue for the overall track, to throw one of those fancy words in there. And I'd like to start off by just going through a few different examples of what compression and mixing sounds like in different scenarios and what you might be using it for. So say we want to drive a lot of character into a certain instrument or drums or whatever it might be, an element of your track. What you're going to be usually doing is, especially if you know the sound that you're going for, you might go for a vintage EQ, a vintage compressor, and drive that compressor to the point to where you start really hearing it work. And I'm going to just go ahead and play a little example of that here. I'm using an FET compressor on drums, which is something I wouldn't usually do, of course, but in this scenario it's a really good example of illustrating the sound of a compressor and what you're really going for when you're mixing. So let's give this a quick listen. So right away you can hear that the volume's bumped up a bit more, of course, but mainly what you're hearing is just the sound of the compressor. I'm really driving this compressor in a sense where you really start hearing it work, and that's really what we want. Is we don't want it to be too subtle. Again, this depends on the scenario, of course. Sometimes you just want to add a bit of that tone in, and that's where, say, parallel processing comes in really handy, or just subtly driving a certain or even different type of compressor. Again, in one of my videos I go over all the different types of vintage compressors out there and different tones and different characteristics and why you might want to use one or the other on a certain thing. But that's really what in mixing we're trying to achieve, is just really using these compressors more so heavily than we would in mastering. And I'll just show a different example here where all I'm really doing is using a compressor as a leveler almost. So for the vocal, as you can see here in the waveform even, there's a few minute little peaks here and there, and it's not really that level. And a compressor essentially just compresses that signal and helps level that out a bit more to make sure that the audio is more consistent. And this again can help place stuff in the mix a lot better, especially with vocals. It'll make sure that some words don't just randomly disappear here and there and others are really, really loud. Of course, volume automation is a big part of this as well if you want to pay much attention to detail, but a compressor can just be a very quick fix, especially if you're trying to just get a sound or an impression of something really quickly. So let's give that a quick listen.
But did not prove to be successful outside Chicago. But did not prove to be successful outside Chicago. But did not prove to be successful outside Chicago. But did not prove to be successful outside Chicago. But did not prove to be successful outside Chicago. But did not prove to be successful outside Chicago.
So you can see how much more I let the compressor work, the more everything just starts leveling out more. And this, again, is helpful in certain situations. Also notice that I'm using a compressor which doesn't really have any sound added towards, so I'm really just using this as a leveler. And now let me go ahead and play a quick example of what maybe combining the two would sound like. And this is usually the type of compression that I usually gravitate towards, is something in between. This is where I'm adding a characteristic to the sound that I'm placing it on, and I'm also using it as a bit of a leveling device. So let's give this a quick listen here.
Ready, set, go, 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 ready.
So you can really hear those mu characteristics taking over and just adding a bit of crispiness, and overall it just feels like a much more solid sound. And this is really the approach that we're taking here while mixing. Whereas in mastering, if we change over to that, is you'll see in a second when I go back to the other track that we had in the video, is that the approach is a lot more subtle. And as well mentioned, the glue compressor, in a sense, that's already taking us towards the intention of what the mastering compressor is essentially for. And I'm going to go ahead and show you different examples and what I'm doing here, for example, with my compressors. So let's go ahead and quickly check out what this SSL G-Bus compressor is doing, and also notice that I have this set on a dry wet. I don't have it set to fully wet, making sure that I'm getting some of that characteristic in. I really want that sucking pumping effect from the SSL G-Bus, but I don't really want it to act as much as of a leveler or getting all of that characteristic in. I just want a slight bit of it. So let's give that a quick listen to what that does to the groove of the track. So you can really tell how the characteristics of that compressor just shine through nicely. It's adding a slight bit of volume too, of course, since that's how I like to gain stage masters as well, just adding a bit of volume here and there so I don't have to push the limiters too much at the end. But essentially, really just the kick is coming out a bit more, the snare feels a bit more present, everything's just starting to come together, and that's mainly because I'm really pumping this compressor to get those characteristics of the SSL G-Bus sound, but then basically just deciding how much I want to add in with that. So that's an example of something a bit more extreme in a mastering scenario. And let's look at something which is a bit more subtle, which is essentially that I'm not really doing much of anything. In this case, all I'm really doing is doing the bare minimum that I can to still have that sound presence, but also making sure that I'm not actually compressing. So you can tell here right off the bat that the mu compressor emulation right here isn't doing any compression at all. I actually even have this set on a blend of 50% because I don't want all of the inherent characteristic of that compressor to come through. And then here, for example, I have a very, very particular setup. I have it at a very low ratio of 1:5. And I have it set up in a way which might be a bit peculiar to a lot of people, in the sense that I have it on auto release, aka meaning that it's not the fastest release possible, and that I have a fairly fast attack actually for electronic dance music. And this is because this compressor reacts in a certain way to the sound, the way that I've set it up here. And this is actually very similar to a setup that Chris Lord-Alge would be using on the types of tracks that he's working on. And I really like this drive knob on this compressor, and that really gives me the sound. And this might actually be a bit too much here in terms of what's going on, so you might want to pull that back a bit more. But essentially, I'm not really compressing that much in this sense. I'm just doing the bare minimum so I can get a sound out of what's going on here. And more often than not, I'm actually not doing any compression on the master at all per se. I try to not see the needle move too much, since the valves are usually already so compressed and there's not really much need to it. So unless I'm compressing in a way which creates more dynamics, aka parallel compression, all that stuff, there's really not much space to just decrease that headroom that you don't even have in most cases. So just to seal this off here and bring it home is we're just going to look at a compressor, VCA compressor that I have on the drums here, and just show a final example of what I'm mixing is another just practical example of how in mixing you can take that very similar approach as you would in mastering and just enrich the sound that's there. So let's go ahead and give these drums a little listen and then bypass this as we go. So you can really tell how the compressor is working in the sense, and I'm again pushing this compressor a lot more than I would in a mastering scenario, but in the same sense, with the same mindset, I'm basically just trying to enrich that sound and make it all come together. So there's definitely a fine line in between the two. I'd say the main difference is essentially just how much compression you use and how much of that sound you let in. But the same rules apply, is that you're just using the compressors to either literally just compress and level sounds out, which again is more of a present thing in the mixing stage. Limiters usually take care of a lot of that in the mastering stage, and again you can argue that limiters are a compressor, or at least some form of variation of them. But in mastering, the subtlety is just the whole buildup of the whole chain, basically having a bit of that one characteristic of the one compressor in there, and just setting the levels right. Is I find myself in mastering to constantly be using the same settings and just pushing in the amount of volume that I want through them and see if I like it or not. Whereas in while mixing, I just constantly go around and I'm more creative with the sound that I'm going for. And mixing also allows you to be that, since you're literally just working on creating a sound and not polishing it.